Today we're going to cover this image from my book, and we're also going to cover the most common mistakes that people tend to make when color grading these kinds of environments. Let's go. So we're inside of DaVinci now. This is the final image that we're going to examine today. This is basically the color palette of this image, and then this is the gradient for this image. So right off the bat, you can tell that we're dealing with a perceptually dark image. And we also have a gradient that doesn't have any colors that really pop. We also have a gradient that kind of like splits into two images. And you can just basically tell that the gradient doesn't look so smooth. However, you have to understand that nature is not a painting. Nature is not design. Nature is just what it is. And it is surely going to happen that just because you're taking photographs of nature, you're not going to get a perfect color harmony. Even if you don't have perfect color harmony in nature, you can still work your way around it to make it look pleasing and make it look normal. The last thing you would want to do as a colorist is to have an undesirable color harmony that you really play into, and you end up making everything so saturated that they end up looking even more far apart. So before we get into the tools and the DaVinci logic behind this color grade, I wanted to introduce a color system to you. So what you're seeing on screen right now is basically a visual 3D representation of a color model of the Monsol color system. The Monsol color system is obviously my favorite color system, and it has to be the most influential color system of all time, basically. The reason this particular color system became so influential after its initial release in the early 1900s was because it was truly ahead of its time. Unlike traditional color models like RYB, which is red, yellow, blue, which is mostly used in paint mixing, and RGB, which is basically used for digital screens, the Monsol color system actually has 5 primary colors instead of 3. And the reason that the Monsol color system is so different to traditional color models is because it doesn't necessarily serve a platform. For example, as we just discussed, RYB, red, yellow, blue, is used for paint mixing. RGB is used for digital screens. The Monsol color system is based around how we humans see color on all platforms, basically. Another reason why the Monsol color system was so ahead of its time is because in the early 1900s, every single expert sought to represent colors in like a perfect symmetrical shape. For example, a color sphere. And the reason this doesn't work is purely because of science. Because of the kind of receptors we have in our eyes, we basically have a bunch of wavelength overlap, which basically results in us seeing green and yellow colors as the brightest, basically. And you can also see it right here. This model right here has kind of a unorthodox, unexpected geometrical shape, and this is because it has 3 dimensions. On the vertical axis, what you see is value, which is basically brightness or lightness. Around the circle, obviously, you're going to find hue, which is all the variations of colors that we have. And on the horizontal axis, you're going to find chromaticity, which is how vivid or how colorful a color is. Let's take a look at an example. For example, we have 10.0 yellow. And what you're going to find with yellow, for example, if you look at the entire yellow column right here, is that yellow is indeed a color that tends to be at its most colorful form when it is also the brightest. So by extension, if you want to have an extremely saturated yellow in your work, that is inevitably going to be an extremely bright color and many times extremely distracting as well. So naturally, after white, yellow is basically the second brightest color. And in third place, we have, not so far behind yellow, by the way, we have green. And what that means to us when we look at our image is that if I were to saturate my green so much, that would result in an extremely distracting green image. And by the way, I've already mentioned this, but if you want to train your eyes to see color better, to make better decisions, to have a more efficient thought process behind color, the only thing that you should use is basically the digital color meter. It is a stock app. Basically, wherever you point, it is going to give you the average color within the aperture that you give it. So as you can clearly see right here, even the brightest, most vivid greens in my image are extremely dull in the first place, and this is kind of misleading. And if you're curious, the reason my image can still look like it has a lot of deep colors and a lot of deep contrast without actually having it is because, sure, it might not have a lot of contrast to begin with, but it has extremely good color contrast. Those are obviously 2 different things. One more thing I would like to add to this Monsol color model that we have right here is, I've already said, it has 5 primary colors, which is red, green, yellow, blue, and purple. And the reason behind this is obviously science. So inside of our eyes, we have 3 types of receptors, which are scattered across our retina. Basically, the short wavelengths correspond to roughly blues, and the medium wavelengths respond to roughly greens, and the long wavelengths respond to roughly reds. However, this is slightly misleading. We have 3 types of receptors, so you might be mistakenly misled to believe that we have 3 main colors as well. However, because we have such a large overlap between the medium and the long receptors, we also get a new color, which is yellow. If you scientifically look at the medium and the long cones, you're actually going to find that the long cones do not actually peak at the color red, it actually peaks at the color yellow. However, Munsell was extremely ahead of its time. He basically thought that you cannot produce a color system purely based on color theory, and you cannot produce a color system purely based on mathematics. You have to have both. So the reason this is the most influential color system of all is because this is an empirical one. He basically constructed this entire color space purely based on empirical evidence, which was basically conducting real life experiments, how we see color. And what you're going to find is that on the visible spectrum, you're going to basically get 4 primary colors, which is blue, green, yellow, and red. And you have another color that's not on the visible spectrum, but basically you can get this color by mixing the 2 ends, which is blue and red. You're going to get purple. And this is how you get these 5 primary colors. So if you're color grading an image, and for example, if you're inside of DaVinci Resolve and you look at your vector scope, you're going to find this many times that your color blobs are not producing a visually representative perfect color harmony. However, despite all of this, your image can still look very good, because you have to understand that like digital RGB colors are not evenly spread out to how we actually see color. So concluding all of this, the thing that you should walk away with is that if you're color grading on a digital screen, you shouldn't judge your colors purely based on red, green, and blue. Most of the time in nature, for example, you're not going to get perfect color harmony anyway. However, you can work your way around this. So let's actually see how you can create an image like this one. So here I have my usual power grade that I use for everything. And the first thing that you should always take care of is basic adjustments. To take care of your basic adjustments, the best type of scope to look at is obviously the parade. So what you can tell right away is that we do have quite good separation in the highs, in the mids, and also in the lows, but the entire image is not spread out enough. And how can you tell? Obviously you can tell because the top 10 and the bottom 10% are not occupied basically at all inside of our parade. The first thing that you should think of when you see something like this is obviously to introduce contrast in your image. Now you can do this in many ways. You can use the contrast and pivot sliders right here. Or if you feel comfortable, you can also use the curves. Or if you're extremely lazy, you can just grab a film look creator tool, grab a clean slate, and then just start adjusting your contrast and exposure. Obviously, every single one of these tools is perfect to achieve what you're trying to achieve. You just have to find what you feel most comfortable with and what supports your mental model basically the most. Me, myself, because I care so much about color integrity and color science as a whole, I like to use a combination of the contrast slider and the pivot slider here because these are mathematically perfect. You cannot mess them up. And I also like to use the curve tool to basically compress the top and bottom of my image. Now the next step is obviously color balance, and the first thing that you want to do is to grab your vector scope and examine what you have in your image. Now obviously we can tell right away that our image is extremely biased towards blue, and this is something that we do not want because we want to have adequate color balance. So I'm just gonna grab an empty node, I'm gonna set the gamma to linear, and the reason you wanna do this is because you wanna move colors around in an equal fashion. You don't want to move certain colors around more and certain colors around less. Simply because if you were to do it any other way, the end result is going to be an image that is not true to how it looked in real life. So the best practice for this is to go into your vector scope, turn on your 2x zoom so you can better see what you're doing, and just start moving all of the colors around without even looking at the image. All you're looking at is basically the vector scope. You're mostly going to be concerned with the extremely white blob because that is the majority of the image. And you're going to aim to basically perfectly halve the white parts across your vector scope. So something like this, obviously you can spend more time doing this, but this is basically perfect color balance. Now it's obviously one thing to have perfect color balance. The next thing that you're going to be concerned about is actually introducing color harmony into your image. So basically pushing colors around even more. And purely because of the gradient we have, I can instantly tell that we have clashing colors. These colors are not supporting each other in producing a very soothing color harmony. What they're doing is kind of the opposite. They're kind of fighting with each other because there's no coherence. So because I said that these are colors that are clashing with each other much rather than supporting each other in building color harmony, what I would want to do is basically not introduce so much saturation, because that only puts them even further apart. So methodically speaking, I would like to find out which color is the most problematic, because that is the exact color that I do not want to push so much. In most color grading tutorials, people would tell you that this is the perfect time to introduce a bunch of cool colors in your shadows and a bunch of warm colors in your highs. But this kind of advice does not work here at all. What you should do, instead of introducing even more color into your highs and lows, you should be concerned with the contrast of these two elements. So as you can see, turning this on and off, I basically just qualified the highs, and what I wanted to achieve right here is to have a stronger separation within the highs, but not stronger colors as a whole. Naturally, I did the same thing for shadows as well, and if I start turning on and off these two nodes, you're ultimately going to notice that it certainly pushed colors around, which is not what we wanted, right? Well, of course, as I said, we do not want to introduce more saturation into our image, but we certainly want to have better color contrast. And the reason this kind of methodology works so much better in this case is because if I started introducing even more color into the highs, into the lows, the image would just simply fall apart, and in the end, it wouldn't even look contrasty in the first place. We have already tweaked the highs and the lows. Now it's actually time to emphasize the image. And basically, in order for you to achieve that, you need nothing more than just a few vignettes. So the first vignette that I basically introduced was a gradient one. It was a pretty interesting sight to see, and I knew that I wanted to capture this kind of darkness that we had because of the weather. In my opinion, in a photographic sense, the best tool to couple with a gradient window is obviously the HDR global slider. As I've already said before, the HDR global slider perfectly mimics how a camera works when you're shifting around exposure. Truly, I cannot recommend anything else. For example, a primaries offset or just curves in general. I don't think these work as well as that does. And the next thing I did, I just wanted to take some attention away from the sides, because it's really not the point. And as you can see, emphasis is really now on the middle of the image, which is basically the mountain that we have over here. As I said, sometimes less is more. Instead of overcomplicating your color contrast as a whole, why not just introduce two extremely simple windows right here? Color perception is basically the stage where you start fixing perceptual problem. For example, just by looking at the image, it's not quite clear, but in real life, I clearly remember that basically this side of the image was extremely bright compared to the one on the left, because it was quite literally sunlit. So the best way that I could find to make up for this discrepancy was basically to introduce a quite gentle glow effect. Now, as I said, you have to be very cautious with this, because for example, if you decide to introduce a very, very tiny spread, you're going to get an extremely sharp image. If you use too much gain, it's going to look out of place. But unfortunately, in any sort of like scientific color grading work, what you're going to find is that pushing glow too much is actually going to fall short on delivering the final result in the first place. Because what you wanted to achieve with glow is to actually show through a screen how dreamy something looked, an element of an image may have looked. But this just makes it look like the clouds are emitting light, which is obviously not the goal right here, so don't overdo it. I would recommend sticking with something like this, and the most important thing that you should pay attention to is that you're not blowing your whites. So the reason that you don't want to peak your channels is because that's the exact point where you start losing detail. Now, obviously, as any color gets brighter, you tend to see less of a difference, even if there is detail in the image. But the last thing that you would want is to like go completely overboard, something like this. As I said, like this just doesn't look normal anymore. Whereas if I were to revert it, it naturally looks way smoother and way more realistic. So stick with something like this. Now the next one, this like second to last decision that I decided to take was to actually put some glow in the grass over here. Obviously this was a creative decision. This was something that I decided that I would want to try myself, because I wanted this image to be motivated by the weather. So obviously we had a cloudy sky, we had an overcast weather, but we had sunlight coming in, which was really interesting. And it did actually shine light on the grass somewhat, though not so much, but I wanted to emphasize it to make it feel real. And as you can see, it clearly worked. It serves the purpose. So once again, instead of overcomplicating your color grading workflow with DaVinci tools and plugins and grain and whatever, the first thing that you should think about is that your color grade should always feel motivated. It should always feel motivated. It should always stay true to how it looked in real life, but you do have your creative freedom to go ahead and explore whatever you want. You can go ahead and experiment, and in fact I do actually recommend that everyone goes ahead and does actually experiment with things, because this is the only way that you're going to find what you're comfortable with, what you're good at, and what your style is really like. As you could probably tell so far, I used no secret methodologies, no secret plugins, no secret whatever that people would want to sell you. The only thing that I used is every single free tool inside of DaVinci Resolve and color knowledge, knowing about color. Color science, also introducing the idea that sometimes less is more. Also basically just denying and questioning traditional color grading tutorials as a whole, because complementary colors do not work everywhere. For example, here we have an image where the shadows are entirely green, by the way. Do you think that pushing blues in grass works? Do you seriously want to have blue grass? Because I assume you don't want to have that. So obviously, as I've already said, instead of pushing more color into your shadows, the thing that you should focus on is introducing more color contrast. So now that we created a perceptually uniform image that is true to its nature, so what that means is darks are dark, the mids are relatively bright, and the brighter areas are bright. It's time to introduce the final touches. So far everything that we did is we basically created the barriers, like basically the bottom limit and the top limit for our image where we want to have them. We reoriented the image that it feels natural and real. What we can do right now is slightly shift around the entire image inside the barriers to our liking. So the only thing that I wanted to do is make it a tad bit brighter and a tad bit more contrasty. And I achieved that with the Film Look Creator tool because I think this is one of the best tools to achieve that. And because we want to stay within the barriers, we are no longer introducing any new colors or anything like this. These are basically just fixes. So because I don't want to go out the barriers, the only thing I'm thinking to myself, can I remove any colors to make the image look better? And this sounds very counterintuitive. How can removing color make an image better? Well, I can show you. So because we have a completely different mental workflow, a completely different thought process to color grading as a whole, I'm no longer thinking about DaVinci tools. I'm only thinking about color science as a whole. So just in one sentence, what I see right here is a perceptually uniform image. Sure, I see a dark image, but I have a color that really sticks out, that is not supposed to be there. And if you guess correctly, that is actually the blues. Simply by doing nothing more than just desaturating them a little bit, my image feels a lot more natural. And this for you should be conclusive proof that actually learning color is way more effective and way more useful than purchasing plugins and thinking only of DaVinci tools. So that's it for this one. I hope you learned a lot today and I hope you change your ways of approaching color grading as a whole, at least a little bit. I am going to continue to cover my entire book as a whole, each image one by one, and hopefully continue uploading a few videos per week, basically showing you how I think of certain environments in nature, how I tend to approach different colors, how I use actual color science and color perception to my own advantage within a digital environment, and most importantly, how you can also learn this and do this intuitively without needing any sort of guidance, just straight off the top of your head. So once again, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you in the next one.